please be seated? And the kids are now invited to leave for their worship with Julia and with Mark. They'll join us again for the Eucharist. So this month of September, we are preaching through our new mission statement, which is in your bulletin. She's really excited about our new mission statement. If you got your bulletin, I'm going to invite you to pull it out because it's right there underneath the title Sermon. And I'm going to ask us to read this together. So let's read this together. St. Peter's mission is to cultivate space in New York City for seekers to authentically encounter God. So we are very aware that there's a lot that's not in this mission statement, but we kind of decided that, the mission statement doesn't have to hold everything. Like there's other places where we can do that. But this statement really is the heart of who we are as a church and what we do and from which everything flows. So in the first week, I talked about that word cultivate. So, cultivate is not to create, it's not to develop, it's not even to proclaim, but to cultivate. And this is a word that gets at our belief that the church is a garden, not a factory. It's organic, not industrial. It's not about producing something for the masses to consume. So it's more about cultivating a healthy ecosystem for living things to flourish, more so than creating some 5, 10, 15-year strategic plan that we are trying to achieve. And then last week, Alicia talked about space, spaciousness in a city like New York where space is so scarce on so many different levels. And she talked about the containers that hold us in this space and being able to bring all of who we are, our whole selves, even those parts of us that we try to hide from others, into God's presence. And it's like a mother's womb where loving affirmation and restoration can heal us, not so that we could just be coddled like infants, but to grow into who God has created us to be. And so this week, what we're going to get to is to cultivate space in New York City for seekers. So what do we mean when we talk about seekers? So I shared this story before, but my professor was challenging me about my resistance to mission statements. And he asked me, so who's showing up to St. Peter's from what you've noticed so far? And after giving it some thought, I said, I think it's people who feel like they don't belong elsewhere. And when we brought this conversation into the vestry, there were similar thoughts that were shared and expressed. Folks said, it seems like it's people who struggle with questions of faith and doubt, and they want a place where they can struggle and not be condemned or not being told that they don't have enough faith. It's people who maybe aren't so black and white about things. It's people who wrestle with those shades of gray. Those people who may have been burned by the church at some point, but they haven't given up on God and on faith. But it's kind of hard to name a group of people like that without the mission statement being super long. And so after going back and forth for a long time, we settled on this word, seekers. Now, if you come from an evangelical church tradition, like I did, seeker means not Christian. So maybe some of you have been in those circles where there were seeker-sensitive services, and the seekers were like what we called the unchurched, people who weren't familiar with church. So that's not what we mean when we say seekers. For us, the heart of a seeker is longing. The heart of a seeker is longing. So much of Western Christianity and how we approach discipleship is about knowing. And that's because the Western church is a product of the Enlightenment, right? I think, therefore I am. How can I increase my knowledge about God so that I can love God more, so that I can live my life more faithfully? Seekers, on the other hand, are driven by desire. St. Augustine's famous quote, "O Lord, you have made us for yourself and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. You've made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. He didn't say, our minds are ignorant until we learn about you. He said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. You know, human beings, even the most cerebral among us, are first and foremost lovers, driven by desire. You know, the heart is not just about being like sort of sentimental, the way it is maybe like a Hallmark Valentine's Day card. The heart, from the Hebrew conception of the heart, that's the seat of the person. That's the core of who a person is. And James K. Smith writes that, you know, if we see ourselves in this life as being on a quest or on a journey, he writes that the heart is like a multifunctional desire device that is part engine and part homing beacon. So it's a homing beacon in that our longings point us in the direction of what we seek, and it's like an engine in that it generates the energy that propels us towards that. The Christian life as the integration of our desires, our personal desires, our political vision. You know, in other words, that vision of what we hope a flourishing world would look like, that is grounded in our longing for God and God's reign in our life, which is just simply another way of saying the presence of Jesus that shapes our reality. One thing I ask of the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. Come, my heart says, seek his face. Your face, Lord, do I seek. And so the heart of a seeker is longing, first and foremost. But the second thing that a seeker is that seekers are not afraid to say, I don't know. Seekers are not afraid to say, I don't know. So tomorrow is September 22nd, and September 22nd is what? It's Hobbit Day. Yes, I've trained you well. It is Hobbit Day. So it is no secret around here that I'm a fan of The Lord of the Rings. And in the first movie, The Fellowship of the Ring, there's this scene that I really love. It actually, like, you might laugh at me, but it kind of brings tears to my eyes when I've seen it, and I've seen this many times. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the story of The Lord of the Rings, so there's this little hobbit, Frodo, and Frodo unwillingly comes into possession of the ring of power that was forged by the Dark Lord Sauron in the fires of Mordor. And the problem is, the ring is always trying to get back to its master, and its master earnestly desires the ring, because once he gets the ring, all of Middle-earth will fall under his evil reign. So, there's a pivotal scene, some of you may remember this, it's at Rivendell, and all of the representatives of Middle-earth have come. So we've got the humans from Gondor, we've got the elves of Rivendell, we've got the dwarves from, and I'm forgetting where they're from, but that mountain. So they're all there with the hobbits. And they know the ring has to be thrown into the fires of Mordor to be destroyed. But the problem is the ring is too powerful. I came this close to showing the clip, but then I felt like I was going to get distracted because I would want to see the rest of the movie. It's a really powerful scene. So the ring is too powerful. And the problem is they don't trust each other. You know, everyone's like, I'll take the ring. And they're like, no, I'll take the ring. So it ends up in this like huge scene of fighting. And they're all yelling and screaming at each other. In the middle of this cacophony of shouting, you start to hear this little voice underneath the din. And it's Frodo. And he's saying, I will take the ring. You know, I will take the ring. And he's like shouting. So finally he's shouting to be heard. He's like, I will take the ring. And they all fall silent. And he says in this like shaky voice and with this like really scared look on his face, he says, I will take the ring to Mordor, but I don't know the way. And I think the reason why that resonates with me so much, that scene, is because I have felt that way so many times in my life. Like, I don't know. I don't know the way. I don't know where to go. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. What I do know is that I can't go back to where I was, and I can't stay where I am, and I can only move forward. I have to go forward. but I don't know the way. And like Abraham in Hebrews 11:8, it says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to set out for a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he set out not knowing where he was going. I mean, can you imagine that? Going out on a journey and just not knowing where you're going? But any great adventure or quest or journey, by definition, means that you don't know the way. And the journey is discovering it as you go. There's that saying, you make the road by walking. If you already know where you're going, that's not an adventure. That's a commute, right? And as Rilke says, the poet, in his letters to a young poet, he says, you live the questions. He writes, be patient towards all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. In other words, it would just be head knowledge for you if you were given the answer right now. And he writes, the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. The first half of my life, everything was about certainty and answers and knowing. And that certainly had a role to play in my younger years. But the second half of my life, now that I'm in my 50s, is so much about learning to embrace the mystery of God, of uncertainty and not knowing. And rather than freaking out in anxiety, being able to just stay open to God and to let the Spirit of God lead. And what that means, though, is that to be a seeker is to be vulnerable. And we hate being vulnerable, right? It's to curb that impulse to try and control everything and to manage everything and to just strive and to try to resolve this tension that you just can't stand. And instead to give yourself over to the only thing that we can ever be sure of in this life, and that is that nothing can separate you from the love of God that is in Christ. Nothing can separate you from that love. So in my fears and in my darkest of nights, the love of God. In the uncertainty of what lies ahead of me, when I cannot see the road ahead of me, the love of God. In the suffering of our world, where it's so hard to feel hopeful when we see so much brokenness and violence, the love of God. And don't get me wrong here. Just because we don't know the way doesn't mean that we're paralyzed, or passive. In fact, it's the exact opposite. 2 Corinthians 5:14 says, for the love of Christ compels us. The love of Christ, receiving of that love, the giving of that love, that's what propels us forward, step by step by step, even when we can't see the end. Hebrews says, all these luminaries of the faith, when you read Hebrews chapters 11 and 12, all these luminaries of the faith, it says that they died without receiving what was promised. They died without receiving what was promised, right? And especially for us American Christians, we're like Amazon Christianity. Give it to me now. Give it to me today. And we don't know what it's like. As Karl Rahner, the Catholic theologian, says, he says, every life in the end is an unfinished symphony. And you can resist it, or you can embrace it. And there's a grace, and there's a transformation, and there's a healing, and there's a restoration when we can learn to give ourselves to that love that will never let us go. It says in Hebrews, they confess that they were strangers and foreigners on earth. And I take that to mean another way of saying that they were seekers. For people who speak in this way, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. They desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, he has prepared a city for them. Then he goes on to say, therefore, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. Jesus didn't want to go through the cross. He said it himself. He said, "Take this cup from me." But he endured that tension. He held that because he knew that there was something better. There was a joy set before him, endured the cross, scorning its shame, and led him to sit at the right hand of the Father. And that's why when he says to Peter in John's gospel, "Peter, do you love me?" Because love might lead you into some places that you don't want to go. But know that that's not the end. You may not want to go there, but like me, I endured the cross, scorning its shame, because there was a joy, there was something deeper, there was something more enduring, there was something that even outlasts this lifetime, that ultimately that's what you want, that's what you long for, the very presence and reality of God. And that's what enables us, right, in a time like this, in a world like this, to not give up hope. I was listening to a message by Reverend Munther Isaac. Maybe some of you have seen him. He's a Palestinian pastor in Bethlehem. And he was talking about Gaza and the genocide that is happening there. And he said, "Hey, there's millions of people around the world who are protesting. I know there are people who are fighting on behalf of the people, of our people." And he said, and it just seems like there's this dominating power that's just steamrolling over it all. But because of his hope in Jesus, even if he never sees the end, he is never going to stop fighting for that distant horizon that he sees. Because he is a seeker who, like these luminaries of the faith, they desired a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. So the heart of a seeker is longing. And this morning, I want to ask you, what do you desire? What are the longings of your heart? And I bring desire and longing up a lot because desire has often been suspect in the church. It's often been seen as something bad or something too tempting. But desire is foundational to our life with God. Our personal desires, what we're holding for our own lives and the lives of people we love, our political vision, that vision of the flourishing of our world, and our longing for God, all of that coming together as we love and worship and follow God. So the heart of a seeker is longing. And seekers aren't afraid to say, "I don't know. I don't know the way. I can't see ahead of me." And so what are those crossroads? What are those thresholds that you're standing in today where you feel vulnerable this morning because you don't know? And you are so tempted to want to control things, to strive to control things, to have those answers. But instead, you're being called to live the questions. So I'm going to just invite you to bow your heads with me. And we're just going to give some space and for some silence. And maybe there's one of those two questions, that resonates with you. Like, what do you really long for? What are you desiring? And how do you want to bring that into God's presence this morning? Or, where are you saying, "God, I don't know, I can't see the way ahead of me"? Can I trust that nothing can separate from me from your love, and that as I stay near to you step by step, that I know you will not forsake me and leave me alone? So let's just take a moment to sit with those in God's presence. I'm going to invite us to stand, and I'm going to close with this blessing by Stephen Charleston, who's a Native American elder and the Bishop of Alaska. And as you feel led, I invite you to hold your hands out to receive this blessing. And it says, "Bless the seekers, our traveling tribe, our motley crew, caravan of the conflicted and courageous, stumbling toward paradise, the hurt and the hopeful, the wounded healers, singing along the way. Spirit, bless the seekers. Life within their tents is never easy, but life without them would be darkness beyond imagining. Bless the seekers, dear Spirit, your stubborn flock, your love living for love, your dream of what might be." Amen.